Welcome to Build Noet. Up until now, we've experienced Noet primarily through Oana, and that makes sense. She woke up in a body she didn't recognize, surrounded by people she didn't know, on a planet she didn't understand. For the first few chapters, her world needed to be small because her world was small. She was trying to figure out who she was, where she was, and how to survive long enough to answer either of those questions. But Chapter 6 changes that. For the first time, we're going to step away from Oana and the Emberborn and begin exploring the other peoples of Noet. And we're starting with the Sulvarins. You've already encountered them. In Chapter 5, they entered the Hoodoo Desert during the storm, hunting and forcing the Emberborn into hiding. But so far, we've only seen them from the outside. That's about to change. The Sulvarins are the antagonists of the Calrics. But like almost everything else on Noet, I don't want that role to be a flat representation. Nothing here exists simply because the story needs a villain, a ruined city, a war, or a strange-looking alien. Everything has a history. There are reasons the Calrics built the way they did. There are reasons the Emberborn exist. There are reasons the water stopped flowing. And there are reasons the Sulvarins became the people who eventually conquered the Calrics. That doesn't mean those reasons excuse what they do. It means I want to understand how they got there. What kind of environment shaped their bodies? What kind of environment shaped their civilization? What did they originally have to become in order to survive? And what happens when adaptations that once preserved life become cultural beliefs about strength, weakness, power, and human worth? Before the Sulvarins were the antagonists of someone else's story, they had a story of their own. To understand that story, we're going into the Sulvar Mountains. But before I explain the volcanoes and the geothermal systems, I need to go back more than 20 years. Because the Sulvarins you're about to meet are not the Sulvarins I originally created. When I first started developing Noet, the Sulvarins actually had gray skin. Their young people had black hair, which gradually became white as they aged. The Emberborn looked completely different. They had pale blue skin and dark hair. But to explain where those early designs came from, I have to go back even further. Strangely enough, one of the earliest characters came from a mistake I made because I was trying to be cool. In the early 1990s, some of my friends played Magic: The Gathering. I knew absolutely nothing about it, but one day I decided I was going to buy some cards too. Except I bought the wrong game. Instead of Magic, I accidentally bought the cards called Blood Wars. I never actually learned how to play Blood Wars either, but I kept the cards because I loved the character art. There was one card in particular that captured my imagination: Talani Champion. I didn't know anything about the character or the lore behind him, so my imagination filled in the blanks. I imagined someone sleek, stealthy, mysterious, and incredibly capable. Basically, my idealized ninja. And that eventually became Cully. You can definitely see that I was a novice writer because Cully was perfect. He was cool, competent, and always seemed to know what he was doing. But the cards were only the beginning. Before Noet became its own world, I was playing around with stories inspired by Greek and Roman mythology. Then, around 2002, I saw Lord of the Rings. That changed everything. What captured me wasn't that I wanted to create another Middle-earth, it was the realization that a story could have an entire world behind it. Different peoples, cultures, histories, landscapes, languages, conflicts, and ways of understanding existence. I wanted to build a world too. The people I originally called the ancient Noetans represented righteousness and holiness. The problem was that I didn't really know what righteousness or holiness looked like, so I made them perfect. Then there were the Sulvarins, who would eventually become the Sulvarins. They represented power, strength, dominance, and control, essentially what I would now describe as toxic masculinity. The wildlings represented the opposite extreme, toxic femininity. And caught between them were the ancient Noetans, the perfect people that both cultures eventually destroyed. That was the original moral structure of the story. Over the next 20 years, those archetypes became people. Cully stopped being perfect, the ancient Noetans became capable of failure, and the Sulvarins and wildlings needed reasons for becoming the cultures they were rather than simply existing as representations of masculine and feminine corruption. I wasn't yet asking why a culture might value strength, why another might develop in the opposite direction, or what holiness actually looks like when practiced by imperfect people. With God steering the wheel, what began as an ideal became more real, and that transformation is really what you're seeing through Build Noet. I'm not throwing away those original ideas. I'm discovering what has to exist underneath them. But instead of going deeper into mythology, I went in the opposite direction. I started asking, could I create a fantasy world that might actually exist? And there was a reason that mattered so much to me, why it had to be believable. Around that time, I kept hearing people criticize historical movies for everything they got wrong. In Gladiator, Troy, The Last Samurai, people would pick apart the clothing, the weapons, the events, the cultures, the timelines. I remember realizing that if I wrote fiction, people could do the same thing to me, which the thought gave me enormous anxiety. Part of that came from being a young woman growing up in the 1990s and early 2000s. The culture surrounding women then could be vicious in ways that were packaged as comedy, romance, or empowerment. Just look back at the movies and television of the period. American Pie, Cruel Intentions, She's All That, Can't Hardly Wait, Varsity Blues, Road Trip, National Lampoon's Van Wilder and Senior Trip, Beverly Hills 90210, Sex and the City. Later there was Wedding Crashers, where the joke about taking a woman's virginity caused her to become a stage 5 clinger. There was also Swingers, representing the dating culture with things like negging, where undermining a woman's confidence could actually be presented as a strategy for attracting her. I mean, even now we still have ghosting. So for me, growing up inside that culture, there was an incredible confusing message surrounding female sexuality and power. Virginity could make you naive or undesirable. Sexual experience could make you sophisticated. Independence meant power. Career, control, attachment, they all meant power. At the same time, I was being raised Catholic. The church said not to have sex before marriage, but I didn't understand why. For me, it was largely presented as the rule, don't. I wasn't being taught how sexuality connected to covenant, attachment, discernment, responsibility, or how to recognize whether someone was actually capable of loving me well. Nobody was teaching me how to choose a husband. I remember my grandfather dropping me off at college and giving me his dating advice. Only date Irish Catholic men. There was just one problem. I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to do with that information. I didn't grow up in his world where ethnicity, family, neighborhood, and religion could immediately tell you something about the community a person came from. I grew up being taught that religion was private. Church and state were separate. You didn't bring religion into everything because you didn't want to offend people that didn't believe. So how was I supposed to identify an Irish Catholic man? More importantly, why did it matter? I didn't understand what my grandpa was trying to protect. The gap became painfully obvious in college. After the movie Stigmata came out, a group of my friends wanted to have a debate about the different Christian denominations. I was Catholic. I should have been able to explain Catholicism, except I had never read the Bible. The Protestants in the room knew more about my own religion than I did. I couldn't defend what I supposedly believed because I didn't actually understand it. So I was caught between two systems. One gave me rules I didn't understand, the other gave me freedom without giving me wisdom, and I was trying to construct an identity somewhere between them. At 19, I dropped out of college because I was pregnant. I had my daughter 3 days after I turned 20. Now, I had crossed another invisible cultural boundary. I was the first person in my Catholic family to have a child outside of marriage. The culture around me had taught me that being virginal was undesirable and sexually inexperienced women were naive. Then pregnancy outside marriage suddenly carried an entirely different judgment. The rules seemed to change after you crossed the line. And the relationship with my ex, my daughter's father, itself was emotionally, mentally, and psychologically abusive. When my daughter was 6 months old, I was finally able to leave her father, and he told me something I would remember. No other man would want me because I had a baby. The terrible part was, he was right. I remember hearing women discussed in terms that reduced their worth to a kind of marketplace calculation. On Loveline, I heard Adam Carolla use an appliance analogy for dating women. The basic concept was that an extraordinarily attractive woman with a child was a used brand name appliance, while a less exceptional woman without children could be preferable simply because she was a new generic appliance. Imagine hearing that as a young single mother. I wasn't a California dime. I wasn't some perfect woman whose beauty might compensate for the liability of having a child. So what did that make me? A middle-of-the-line used appliance? That language sounds grotesque when I say it plainly, but that is exactly the point. I became acutely aware of how easily a human being could be reduced to a category. Single mother, used, baggage, welfare woman abusing the system and popping out kids. The version of female empowerment I often felt surrounded by seemed to say that becoming a strong woman meant adopting qualities traditionally associated with masculinity. Don't need anyone, don't be emotional, don't be innocent, don't be romantic, don't be soft, don't be the girl with her head in the clouds. That last one mattered to me because I was that girl. I also looked younger than my age, which meant I already struggled with feeling that people didn't take me seriously. When I would become angry, boyfriends would tell me I was cute. I didn't want to be cute. I wanted my anger to matter. I was told that life wasn't like the movies, that I had my head in the clouds, that men wanted women who were more down to earth. When relationships ended in betrayal, the message I absorbed was that commitment itself made me a liability. Wanting permanence made me suffocating. Wanting romance made me unrealistic. There were also moments when the sexual culture around me stopped being something on a movie screen. Men could speak about my body as though access to it were simply part of being a woman in public. I remember being at a bar and being told that I looked like I wanted to be fucked that night. Experiences like that did something to the way I imagined power. When I was betrayed, dismissed, cheated on, or sexually harassed, I didn't fantasize about being rescued because I knew no one was coming. I fantasized about becoming impossible to dismiss. I imagined walking into a room angry and having the ground shake beneath my feet. I wanted people to be afraid to underestimate me. I wanted power that could be felt before I ever had to explain myself. Even decades later, there are new categories available. A woman becomes angry or objects to something publicly, and she can simply become a Karen. Once the label is applied, you no longer have to take her seriously. So when I saw The Lord of the Rings and watched an imaginary world become something enormous enough to capture people's attention, I didn't simply think, I want to write fantasy. I thought, I want to build a world big enough to communicate things I didn't yet know how to say directly. A world where I could take the covert brutality I experienced around me and make it visible. That distinction matters. The brutality I knew wasn't usually a dragon burning down a village. It was quieter. It was a joke, a label, a backhanded compliment, an ex telling you nobody else would want you, a culture telling you what made you desirable, and then punishing you for the consequences. A rule you were expected to obey without being given the wisdom underneath it. A system assigning your value before asking who you were. That was the kind of brutality I understood. I didn't want to write a magical fairy tale because, at that point in my life, fantasy without something concrete underneath it felt too vulnerable. I was afraid of being perceived as weak. If someone dismissed my imaginary world as the fantasy of a girl with her head in the clouds, it would reinforce exactly what I was already fighting against. No, my world was going to be believable. I was going to research it. I would understand it. I would build the planet underneath the story. I would create the cultures, biology, environments, and eventually the physics necessary to hold it together. If someone wanted to tell me my head was in the clouds, then I was going to learn how the clouds were formed. Noet wasn't scientific because I loved science. Science gave my imagination armor. It's how you fight against unbelief. I wanted a story I could dominate with. I wanted to create something so thoroughly constructed that nobody could dismiss the person who created it. I wanted to build something that nobody could use my imagination as evidence against me. I wanted to create something that made it impossible to overlook my value. And looking back now, that is fascinating, because I was creating a story about identity while still trying to prove my own. I was building a world around transformation while using that world as armor. And I was imagining civilizations obsessed with strength before I understood how much of my own definition of strength had been shaped by the fear of being perceived as weak. And more than 20 years before I understood what the Sulvarins would eventually become, I was already immediately familiar with one of the central problems of their civilization. How do I make myself matter in a world that doesn't seem to care whether I do? The Sulvarin answer became strength. If the mountain can overpower us, we will become powerful. If our environment cannot be controlled, we will learn to control everything we can. If weakness leaves us vulnerable, we will eliminate weakness. If the world does not assign us value, we will create systems that do. Rank, achievement, strength, endurance, authority, status. Suddenly, power isn't simply about wanting to dominate someone else. Underneath it is a desire to become undeniable, to matter, to be seen, to possess enough strength that the world can never treat you as insignificant again. And I recognized that impulse. I didn't build an empire to conquer another civilization. I built Noet. When I felt that my imagination could be used as evidence that I was naive, I tried to make my imagination unassailable. Research it, prove it, build the physics beneath it, make it so thoroughly constructed that no one could dismiss it. Science gave my imagination armor. The Sulvarins put armor around their civilization, and in both cases, underneath the armor is the question of value. That's something I've come to recognize throughout the entire writing process. No story a writer creates is ever completely detached from the person writing it. We put ourselves into our worlds even when we don't realize we're doing it. Our fears get in, our desires get in, our wounds get in, our ideas about strength get in. Even the things we haven't understood about ourselves yet can find their way onto the page. 20 years ago, I thought I was creating a civilization obsessed with power. Now I think I understand that what was underneath their desire for power was that they simply wanted to matter. And that's where the tragedy of the Sulvarins really begins, because wanting to know that you matter isn't evil. Wanting your life to have value isn't evil. Wanting to become strong enough that you can't be easily destroyed isn't necessarily evil. The distortion happens when power becomes the proof that you matter. Then weakness doesn't simply mean that you need help, it threatens your identity. Failure doesn't simply mean that you failed, it lowers your worth. Someone stronger than you isn't merely stronger, they become more valuable. And someone weaker becomes less valuable. Eventually, you haven't conquered the fear that you don't matter, you've built an entire civilization around it. And I think this is where the fruit becomes rotten, because Sulvarins are trying to answer a legitimate question, what gives me value? But they're trying to answer it through their own personal strength and power. If I can endure more, I matter. If I can accomplish more, I matter. If I can rise higher, I matter. If I can conquer what threatens me, I matter. If other people submit to me, I matter. The problem is that none of those things can actually establish identity. They can only continually test it. If my value comes from being strong, I can never safely become weak. If my value comes from winning, I can never safely lose. If my value comes from my position, someone beneath me becomes necessary to prove that I'm above them. And if my identity depends upon my own strength, then I have to keep proving that identity for the rest of my life. That's the trap. Because the answer the Sulvarins are searching for isn't found in becoming powerful enough to make the world acknowledge their worth. It's found in God. Identity is received before it's proven. Value isn't something we manufacture through achievement, dominance, endurance, status, or control. It comes from belonging to the one who created us. And that changes the purpose of strength. Strength no longer has to prove that I matter. It becomes something I can use because I already know that I matter. Weakness no longer erases my identity. Failure no longer changes my value. Someone else's strength doesn't diminish me, and someone else's weakness doesn't make them worth less than me. The Sulvarins don't understand that. So they take something good, strength, and ask it to answer a question it was never capable of answering. The volcano didn't make them evil. It gave them a problem to solve. They learned to survive it. They learned to harness it. They carved their homes into its lava tunnels. They captured its geothermal energy. They learned to endure its heat. Eventually, they became so good at conquering the mountain that conquest became part of how they understood themselves. The survival principle was, we must become strong enough to survive. Then, survival became identity. Our strength proves our worth. And eventually, identity became hierarchy. Our strength gives us the right to determine the worth of others. That's how the fruit becomes rotten, not because strength, survival, or the desire to matter is rotten. The root is where they look for the answer. They try to establish through their own power and might an identity that can only be received from God. And once worth has to be earned, somebody will always end up being worth less. That is how civilization, built to survive the mountain, eventually begins treating people the way the mountain does, as expendable. For Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, the spiritual world is inhabited by living ideas, archetypal symbols, and myths that are rooted in the human body, shaped by culture, and essential for forming definitions and transformation. That distinction has become even more important as I've returned to Noet 20 years later, because science has advanced considerably since I first imagined this planet. Research that wasn't readily available to me then can now challenge things I designed as a young adult. And sometimes popular culture beat me to an idea before I finished mine. The original Emberborn were probably my favorite example. They had pale blue skin and dark hair. Then Avatar happened. I went into the theater in 2009 and watched James Cameron put blue-skinned people on another world. I came out from that theater thinking, well, there goes that idea. Obviously, when I joke that Cameron stole my idea, I don't mean Cameron somehow knew about my unpublished characters, but I did know what would happen if I kept them blue. It wouldn't matter that I had been developing the Emberborn for about 7 years before Avatar. People would see them and think, Avatar. So the blue Emberborn had to go. Then there were the names. I already had Radic when Vin Diesel returned as Riddick in 2013. Riddick? Seriously? Then Moana arrived in 2016. And here I was with Oana. I even had a friend name their child Kylan. At that point, I put my foot down. You people can have the colors. You're not getting my character names. As funny as those coincidences are to me now, they also touch something much deeper about the way I've come to understand creativity. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious gave him a way of explaining why archetypal patterns repeatedly emerge across dreams, religions, myths, and cultures. Campbell explored something related through comparative mythology. Again and again, cultures separated by geography and history tell stories containing remarkably similar patterns: the descent, wilderness, death and rebirth, the threshold, the guide, the transformation, and return. That doesn't mean every similar story was copied from another story. It suggests that human beings repeatedly encounter some of the same fundamental patterns. Emanuel Swedenborg approached this from a much more explicitly spiritual direction. His theology described physical realities as corresponding to much deeper spiritual realities and presented the spiritual world as structured by affections, truths, ideas, and states. Jung, Campbell, and Swedenborg are not saying exactly the same thing, but they each gave me a different way of thinking about something I kept encountering while creating Noet. Maybe ideas are not always as private as we think they are. My faith takes that question somewhere more personal. I believe Noet is a story God purposed me to write. That doesn't mean I believe every individual idea inside it belongs exclusively to me. In fact, my experiences over the past 20 years have pushed me toward almost the opposite conclusion. I don't own the pattern. I am responsible for what I do with the particular expression entrusted to me. So every time something strangely familiar appeared somewhere else, it became another reminder. Having an idea is not the same thing as bringing it into the world. The blue people became a thing. A name sounded suspiciously close to Radic. Another sounded dangerously close to Oana. And every time I was confronted with essentially the same question, are you going to write this thing or not? Because if God wanted particular truths expressed through story, I couldn't assume those truths would sit around indefinitely waiting for me to cooperate. Someone else could pick up the torch. someone else could encounter part of the pattern. Someone else could tell a completely different story carrying some of the same underlying ideas. The story did not need my permission to exist. I needed to decide whether I was willing to participate in telling the version entrusted to me. And that, strangely enough, brings us right back to the Sulvarins, because their appearance has been evolving almost as long as the story itself. They began gray. The Emberborn began blue. Eventually, the Sulvarins became powder white. And at the time, that white skin made perfect sense because I imagined them living on Noet's cold, dark night side. Then I came back to the science, and the science moved them. The Sulvarins weren't going to live in darkness anymore. They were going to live in fire, which left me with a new problem. Why would a people who evolved in one of the hottest, most volcanically active regions of Noet have powder white skin? Once again, I thought research might force me to throw away an old design. Instead, it gave me a reason to keep it. There is another side to volcanic environments that I really wanted to preserve because the Sulvar Mountains should not simply be a wasteland. Volcanoes are destructive, but volcanic regions can be extraordinarily productive. Weathered volcanic material can create fertile soils containing minerals that support abundant plant growth. Once an eruption has passed and the landscape begins recovering, mosses, ferns, and other pioneering vegetation can recolonize disturbed ground. The mountains themselves can also create localized microclimates. High elevations intercept moisture, producing areas of heavier precipitation and allowing dense vegetation to develop where the conditions are right. So, I imagine the Sulvar Mountains as a landscape of extremes. There are black basalt fields beside explosions of vegetation. Jagged obsidian and steep caldera walls give way to mineral-rich valleys. Steam rises through forests. Water collects around geothermal systems. Hot springs and mineral pools form naturally throughout the region. The Sulvarins live surrounded by evidence that destruction and abundance can come from exactly the same source. The volcano kills, the volcano feeds. The volcano destroys the land, the volcano creates new land. And I think that contradiction would become enormously important to the way the Sulvarins understand fire. Their environment also gives them tremendous natural resources. Basalt provides durable stone. Obsidian can produce extremely sharp edges. Volcanic ash and rock can become building materials. Deposits of softer volcanic material, such as tuff, can even be carved directly into structures. And geothermal activity gives the Sulvarins something most civilizations on Noet do not possess so abundantly: heat beneath their feet. That changes architecture. It changes bathing, food preparation, industry, agriculture. Instead of simply enduring their environment, the Sulvarins have learned to harness it. Their civilization becomes an extension of the mountain itself. I picture portions of their cities carved into volcanic rock, with enormous stone halls, geothermal baths, channels carrying heated water, and chambers warmed naturally from below. Even their palace can communicate the same idea. The Sulvarin king does not merely rule near the mountain, he rules from within it. Then there is the atmosphere. Active volcanic regions can release steam, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases. Sulfur dioxide interacting with atmospheric moisture can contribute to acidic precipitation, while major eruptions can throw enough material into the atmosphere to temporarily darken the sky. That gave me another interesting piece of Sulvarin psychology. Their world can change very quickly. A mountain that has been quiet can become dangerous. A familiar path can disappear. The air itself can become hazardous. Rain can become corrosive. The ground beneath you is never completely trustworthy. For generations, Survival would require watching for warning signs, smelling changes in the air, feeling tremors, watching steam vents, knowing which water is safe, recognizing when animals begin behaving differently, understanding when the mountain is telling you to leave. That creates a culture that pays very close attention to signs of instability. And eventually, I think that instinct would extend beyond geology. They begin looking for instability in people, family, soldiers, rulers, kingdoms. Weakness is not simply undesirable. Weakness might be the tremor before the eruption. And this is where the Sulvarins become particularly interesting to me. There is nothing inherently evil about adapting to a dangerous environment. Strength, discipline, endurance, preparation are all useful. The problem begins when qualities necessary for survival become measurements of human worth. Someone who cannot climb as quickly is no longer simply less capable of climbing, they are inferior. Someone who cannot withstand the same physical punishment is not simply physically different, they are weak. Someone who questions authority threatens order. Someone who fails publicly becomes evidence that they never deserved their position. Eventually, survival of the fittest stops describing their environment and starts defining their society. The mountain has become a hierarchy. Those capable of enduring the greatest heat rise toward the top. Those perceived as weaker descend toward the bottom. And their king stands at the center of that system as the person who is supposed to embody the strength of the entire people. That gives me the foundation I need for Sulvarin religion, because their beliefs about fire, worthiness, hierarchy, loyalty, family, and authority did not appear out of nowhere. They grew from generations of people staring at a mountain that seemed to tell them the same thing over and over. Only what withstands the fire remains. The tragedy is that they eventually mistake what remains for what is worthy, and those are not necessarily the same thing. Moving the Sulvarins from the cold night side of Noet to one of the hottest regions created another problem: their appearance. By this point, I had already redesigned the Sulvarins with extremely pale, almost mineral white skin and orange structures running through it that looked like glowing fissures. That design made intuitive sense when I thought they lived in darkness and cold. Now, I had to put the same people next to volcanoes. So I had to ask, would this biology make any sense at all? At first, I thought the answer was no. We're taught a pretty simple rule about heat. Dark surfaces absorb more energy. Light surfaces reflect more. So wouldn't people living in an infrared-rich environment around a red dwarf star need dark skin? That's where the science became much more interesting. White to our eyes doesn't mean white to infrared. The first thing I had to separate was visible color from infrared behavior. Something that appears white to the human eye is reflecting a large portion of the wavelengths our eyes can see. That doesn't necessarily tell us how that same material interacts with infrared radiation. We can actually see this principle in human skin. Human skin has very high thermal infrared emissivity, usually measured around 0.97 to 0.99. Research comparing different human skin tones has found no significant difference in thermal infrared emissivity based on pigmentation. In other words, light skin and dark skin look dramatically different to our eyes, while behaving much more similarly at the thermal infrared wavelengths used to measure body heat. That gave me some breathing room with the Sulvarins. Their powder white appearance doesn't have to mean that their skin behaves as white across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So I began treating Sulvarin skin almost like a biological composite. The outer tissue could contain microscopic structures or compounds that strongly scatter visible light, creating that chalky, mineral white appearance. Different structures and pigments could provide protection at dangerous wavelengths. and the skin could simultaneously remain an extremely efficient emitter of the Sulvarins' own thermal infrared radiation. The result is an organism that looks almost white to us while having very different optical properties outside the wavelengths our eyes can see. And that's important because the Sulvarins have the opposite problem from the people I originally imagined living on the night side. They don't need to collect more heat. They need to get rid of it. Then I started looking at the orange structures. I call them fissures because that's what they resemble visually. But biologically, their skin isn't cracked. The surface remains completely smooth. The orange structures are underneath it. And this is where I could borrow another mechanism that already exists on Earth. When humans become hot, our bodies increase blood flow toward the skin. This is called cutaneous vasodilation. Blood carries heat from deeper inside the body toward the surface, where the heat can be transferred to the environment. Under severe heat stress, human skin blood flow can increase dramatically. Some animals take this principle even further. Biologists actually describe high vascularized structures such as rabbit ears, rat tails, chicken combs, and even parts of human hands as biological radiators. By changing blood flow through tissue close to the surface, an animal can dramatically alter how much heat it loses. So I exaggerated that real biological mechanism for the Sulvarins. What if they evolved an extensive network of specialized heat exchange vessels immediately underneath their pale skin? When their core temperature begins rising, those vessels dilate. More blood, or whatever the Sulvarin equivalent ultimately is, moves towards the surface, and suddenly those structures become more visible through the pale tissue. That's the orange pattern we see. This is where I get to take the real science and push it into the speculative biology. Human blood vessels don't actually glow orange when they're hot, but they do glow in infrared. Not glow in the visible sense, but become distinguishable as warmer regions in thermal imaging because infrared radiation emitted from the skin reflects underlying temperature, blood flow, and tissue perfusion. Increased perfusion can raise local surface temperature and therefore increase thermal emission. Look at a thermal image of a human body and you don't see the colors our eyes normally perceive. You see a map of heat. Warmer regions are commonly represented by yellows, oranges, reds, and whites. Those colors are normally false color added by the thermal camera. Human infrared radiation itself is an orange light that our eyes can see. But Noet gave me an opportunity to play with that idea. The Sulvarins evolved on a world orbiting a red dwarf star in an environment where infrared radiation is a much more important part of the surrounding energy landscape. So I imagined their visible heat exchange structures as a biological echo of a thermal image. When they're cool and resting, the orange structures are faint. When they're working hard, fighting, climbing, overheated, or exposed to extreme volcanic temperatures, blood flow toward the surface increases. The network becomes brighter. Their bodies begin to look almost like a living infrared heat map. The glowing orange fissures aren't literally infrared radiation becoming visible. That's the speculative part. Instead, I'm imagining specialized compounds or structures associated with those vessels that produce or reveal visible orange copper light as circulation and temperature increase. So what we see visually resembles the heat signature of an infrared world. Put those adaptations together and the Sulvarin design starts making much more biological sense. Their mineral pale appearance doesn't require their skin to behave the same way at every wavelength. Their outer tissues can scatter visible light, while specialized compounds provide protection from damaging radiation and chemical exposure. Their skin can remain highly effective at emitting thermal infrared. Underneath that skin is a specialized vascular network capable of moving enormous amounts of heat toward the surface. And when that system becomes active, the orange copper structures become increasingly visible. The hotter the Sulvarin becomes, the more clearly you can see the system working. That means their appearance isn't merely decorative, it's their thermal regulation made visible. The white, powder skin and glowing orange fissures tell you something about the environment before I ever explain where these people come from. They evolved beneath a red dwarf star. They live among volcanoes. They inhabit one of the hottest regions of Noet. Their bodies are built around surviving heat. And there's something I love about the fact that their skin resembles a thermal image. On Earth, we invented technology that allows us to translate visible infrared radiation into colors our eyes can understand. On Noet, evolution created people whose bodies appear to do something remarkably similar. The Sulvarins carry the visual language of their planet's heat directly on their skin. The mountain isn't just where they live, the mountain is written into their bodies. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Behind the Pages World Building. In our next episode, we will finally address the vision that led to the Sulvarin religion. In the meantime, may God bless you and keep you.